Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I'm the Jack of all Ministries, and today I'm going to show you guys part 3 of my home studio build. So you can probably tell by the length of my hair and the little bit of craziness that goes with it that it's been a little bit of time since I've released part 2 of this video series. Reason why is I've been focusing on a play that we did at church. It's taken all my time. That's why I grew my hair out to begin with. But that's all behind me now, so I can get back on track in releasing these videos. So just a little bit of a recap as to where we are. I've already framed in the 3 exterior walls to this room, as well as adding insulation, electrical, drywall, all of those things to get those walls ready. On the ceiling, I went ahead and insulated that, installed the things that I needed to get lights ready for the future, did some soffits, and I also hung some drywall on some res channel up there. And I also did some blocking in the joists up above because I didn't want sound to transfer from where the studio was going to be through the gap in the joists. And so that brings us to where we are today. So the next step in the process was to start some things that were going to be done in the area that would eventually become the hallway. All right, so in here we have just a little bit of a problem. You know, as you can see up here, I had framed this because we have this opening here, and when you first walk in, it's a little bit awkward because this header or top plate or whatever is going to come right into the middle of the door. And so what I wanted to do was cut it in and come over because I still want to be able to put a single door right here where I'll be able to access the water heater and also the furnace if we ever have to. But when I showed my wife that, she said, no, that's going to be weird to walk into this door and then have a wall just suddenly right in front of you. So she had the idea. She said, well, why don't you just make that a smaller opening? And I thought, I never really thought of that before. I'm going to go ahead and close that off, and it'll end up being about a 28, maybe a 27-inch opening, which is a little bit small. But as long as I can fit my bass drum through the door, which is a 22, I should be fine. So yeah. And so I went ahead and I knocked out the framing for that. I went ahead, I put up the drywall, and all that was just standard construction stuff, not worrying about soundproofing or anything like that, because I wanted the studio to be the portion that took care of that, and the hallway just needed to look good for people that were using it day to day. So once I had the hallway kind of ready to go and I had the exterior portions of the studio ready to go, it was time to put up the 4th wall. Now for the 4th wall, I had an opportunity to do something a little bit different because on the 3 exterior walls that I had already done, I had the benefit of already having 8 inches of poured concrete walls there and ready to go. The ceiling was something I didn't want to mess with too much because it was already existing and I didn't want to drop into the room and lose volume. So I kind of had to work with what I had there using insulation, res channel, drywall, and things like that. But the 4th wall gave me an opportunity to try something basically starting from scratch, and I opted to build a double wall there. So to start putting together the double wall, I decided to do the interior portion of the room first, and I continued the 2x3 construction methods that I had used throughout all of the interior portions of the wall. In hindsight, I wish I wouldn't have done that. This is one of the mistakes that I wish that I could correct. When you're putting in framing for a wall that you want to be soundproof or sound dampened, you want to use heavy lumber. A lot of pros will use 2x10s, 2x12s, something like that, because they're really, really heavy and they don't have a tendency to vibrate. They also give you a little bit more room to work with when you have, 10, 11 inches worth of space rather than just using, the gap that you get from a 2x4 or a 2x3. Now, ultimately, I would eventually use bigger lumber on the outside, but I wish I would have done it on the inside first because that's the first portion of the wall that has an opportunity to vibrate because that's where the sound is coming from. If lumber starts to vibrate, it can do 2 things. It can start to encourage vibration inside the wall cavity, which essentially turns it into a resonator, or it can start to allow vibrational transfer through the wall. So you really want the lumber to be as stable as it can possibly be. And it is on the outside, but I wish I would have done the heavier portion on the inside and the lighter portion on the outside. But live and learn. After I framed up the interior portion of the 4th wall, I went ahead and started with the electrical. I had left some exposed Romex on both sides of the exterior wall framing so that I could bring that in and add a couple of more outlets. In total, I have 4 double gang outlet boxes on the walls, in addition to 2 single gang boxes on the walls, and that gives me plenty of power that I can access easily from virtually anywhere in the studio, and I'm really glad I did that because you always need power when you're doing anything with music. So now right here you can see that I have 1, 2, 3 boxes in place. This one is going to be for the light switch for the lights in here. This one is going to be for the outlets that I'm going to be using. And then that one there on the bottom is going to be for this. I got myself a snake that I'm going to run through the walls so that I have a way to connect to my computer on this side, connect to my drums on the other side, and it'll look seamless in here without a bunch of cables running across the room. And then that way, if I need to record something on this side, I can disconnect the snake, plug directly into the interface, or on that side, I can unplug the drums and plug in whatever it is that I want to record. So just a way to keep it nice and clean. Once I had all the boxes in and ready to go, it was time to jump onto the insulation. I continued using R13 insulation to fit the 24 on center framing that I had installed, and I really think that that was the best way to go because it's a little bit cheaper than using like rock wool or something like that. And again, you typically tend to get better ratings on R13 than you do from Safe and Sound, at least in the STC band. Once that was done, it was time to put the drywall on the interior portion. Now, I want to mention just a little bit of something about the drywall here. I had to do something because I faced a particular challenge when putting it together in my studio. See, I installed this studio in a basement, and so there was a drain actually in the corner of my studio, which gave me a bit of a problem because from one corner of the room down to the drain, there's about a 4-inch drop. And so the framing has to dip down and follow that 4-inch slope. Normally, when you hang drywall, you want the top sheet to be perfectly flush, but since we're overlapping, I want the first layer to be on the floor and then go up, and then I'll alternate it so that the finished one is actually going to be the one at the top. And so this first one that I need to actually mount, I want it to match the slope of the floor, because if I just lay it flat against the curve, it'll actually pull that corner away and leave a gap at the end. And so what I need to do is scribe the floor onto this piece of drywall. So I put a block at the bottom corner here to lift it up so that this end is flat. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pencil and find something that's just the right height, where I'm only coming to this point here, where it's just the right height to barely start making contact with the drywall there. And then I'm just going to slide it along the floor so that it'll actually scribe the slope of the floor. Just like that. So now I can actually see the line, so I can cut that out of the drywall, and when I lean it, it's up against the wall, it's going to follow the shape of the floor, and it only takes a couple seconds to do. So now when you roll this sucker into place, flush against the wall and against the floor. Works every time. So at that point, I would call the interior wall pretty much done so that I could move to the point of setting up the exterior wall, but there were 2 things I wanted to get done first. The first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to run that snake that I mentioned to you earlier. So what I've had to do here is I've taken my snake, right? And I actually took the cable and I ran it through the wall, but I ran it through this outlet plate first, because after this is all installed, I was never going to be able to get a plate, run this through a plate. Obviously it's too big, and when you disconnect this is all wired, so it's not an actual separate plug-in connection or anything like that. And so I had to take this, put it on there, so when I'm ready, after I'm done filling and sealing, I'll slide this into place right in there, and then I'm going to take this, I'm going to mount it up on the wall right here somewhere, so that I'll have a place to actually plug in my mics and stuff like that with my computer on the other side of the room. On this side of the wall, I had to cut a hole in the box, which I'm going to end up filling and sealing later on, which is why I kept this whole back section open so I could see everything back here so I can work with it. I took the cable and ran it up the wall, over the door, okay, and then I'm going to run it back down this side all the way to that other piece there. Now when I build the next wall, it's going to be in front of this, so there's going to be a gap, and this is just going to have to run in between the gap. I didn't want to run it through the studs, not to mention the length is a little tricky. But then you can see on this side, I ran it back in through this side of the wall, where I have the end of all my connectors, and this is plenty long enough to get up to my desk or anything like that. I'm going to try to keep it as tight as I possibly can, so that I can really have some slack if I need it, but you know, I think this is going to work out well. And on this side, I can take the other plate that's going to go here, and I can just go ahead and run these through after when it's time to actually install it. And once I had it all, you know, hung in there and stable and everything like that, made sure that there was still a gap between the framing, even where the snake ran through, I covered all of that with a loose hanging carpeting, which would give me a little bit of a kind of a diaphragmatic, vibration prevention, which is something that I did in most of the walls in the studio to help prevent drywall from vibrating and transferring and stuff like that. So I went ahead and installed that layer of carpeting over the top, and then I began to get to the next point, which was the exterior portion of my double wall. So to begin the exterior portion, I started off with framing, and I used 2x6 lumber. Now, when you hear that, you might not be thinking that that's very heavy. As I mentioned before, I wanted to use something, bigger on the outside portion of the wall once I realized that you need some beef on your framing to prevent vibration. And 2x6s typically are not, really something you would consider substantial when you really want something heavy. But the 2x6s I used are not your typical 2x6s. When you think of, nominal lumber sizes, you think, okay, I'm going to go to Lowe's or whatever and buy a 2x4. Well, it's not actually 2 inches by 4 inches. That 2-inch piece of wood is actually more like 1.5 inches. So I want to go ahead and show you these two. This is a regular 2x6, and these are the ones that I'm actually using. And you can see here, if I kind of overlay it there, you can see how much bigger or how much wider the 2x6 that I'm using is, but also really the big difference is here. You can see the depth difference, and so side by side there, it's quite a bit heftier piece of lumber. So I think that's going to make a big difference in giving me some stability for the framing on the exterior portion of the wall here. It was really great because I was able to get this lumber for free from a buddy of mine. And so it was a cost savings, it was a space savings, and I still got the heft of the wood. And it gave me a nice thick wall that I was able to mount 2 doors on, and it ended up working out really, really well for me. So once I had the exterior portion of the 4th wall framed up, it was time to add insulation. And again, I used the same stuff that I had used on all the interior portions, and then it was time to move on to the drywall. Unfortunately, when I got to the drywall in the hallway, I realized that I had eaten up too much space on the wall. I have a radon pipe there that I really didn't want to have to move, and so I had to settle for using 2 sheets of 1/2 inch drywall instead of 2 sheets of 5/8 inch type X drywall, which is a lot lighter, and it's really not going to do the same amount of job, but I really didn't feel like I had much of an option. I also kind of built a box around that radon pipe so that you wouldn't see that ugly thing showing up in the middle of the hallway, and I put an access panel on it so you could still check the vacuum if you need to. However, I feel like it's pretty important to mention that everything is drywalled behind the radon pipe. So the box that I added was not meant to be soundproof. That panel is not meant to be soundproof because everything is already sealed behind it. It's just on top of something that is already existing to soundproof. Because had I depended on that panel to be the soundproofing portion of that wall, I would have been in for a world of hurt. Once I finished up all the drywall stuff, it was time to move on to installing the exterior door to the studio, because remember, my studio has both an interior and an exterior door. Now, the exterior door has a little bit of a different construction method than the interior door, and there's a couple reasons for that. The interior door that I installed needed to have a certain aesthetic to make my wife happy in the hallway, and so although it is a solid core, it is also pretty lightweight, and it also has a traditional cutout hole for a doorknob that is not very good for soundproofing. You'll see that the interior door is a lot heftier and more sealed, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Well, once I finished that exterior door, I realized that I had a problem. I mentioned before that I had a 4-inch slope from one corner of the room down to the drain, and that was going to give me some problems because I knew that I was going to be recording drums in here and stuff like that, and I didn't want to set up a cymbal stand on a sloped floor and have the cymbals look all crooked and stuff while I was filming and recording, and I wanted to have a flat surface, and so I realized to do that I needed to build up a subfloor underneath me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go all the way around the edge and try to find out where the level lines are and then build up from the high corner. And then when I get to this door here, what I want to do is I actually want that new height and floor, which I'm guessing is going to be about 2.5, 3 inches at that point. I want the door to actually close into the new raised floor, because then I can actually put a seal on it. So instead of on a typical door in a studio where you have seals all the way on the two sides and the top, and then on the bottom where there's a gap, because you have to have a gap for the door to open and close, where they just put a rubber flap. Well, if I can actually have a lip on the bottom, I can actually seal all 4 sides of the door. What I actually did was framed something as low as I possibly could. I didn't want the floor to rise into the room because I had built a 2x3 or 2x4 frame on the floor that was going to lift it into the room, and I was going to lose all that space. And so what I decided to do here is I traced the outside edge of the wall and found out where level was all the way around and marked it. And then I added boards all the way to the outside level, so I knew I had a starting point. Well, from there, I mounted the 2x4s across, and I took it to the point where it was actually going to stay level with the floor. So if it went any further, it would start to raise. So each of these is cut to that outside edge. Then I put 2x4s underneath it at where there's the biggest height difference. And then I turned them on their side and brought them to as close as I could. And then I stuck 1x underneath, and then I even used some wedges. Well, this is actually touching the floor, so I know that this can't get any lower. So 2 1x's sandwiched here, I knew was going to be an equal height. So each of those, that's what's at each of the ends of the boards there. And then I used wedges in the middle for some support, and then the ends of the 1x's are actually drilled in directly to the floor, and then the rest of it is just going to float itself. After I finished the framing, I laid down some insulation in there because I figure I may as well try to keep the floor as sound controlled as possible. And then I went ahead and put plywood over the top of it. And then I had a brand new subfloor that was perfectly level. And I was very happy with it because I still had access to the drain in the corner of the room. So once I finished up the exterior door and the floor, it was time to move to the interior door. Now, when I hung this thing on the inside, I made sure that I used a door that was completely solid core. It is very heavy. And I also installed it in a way to where the only hole that I had to drill through the door was very, very minimal, much smaller than a typical doorknob sized hole. And that's because I installed a freezer handle on the interior portion of the studio, which just locks itself and it locks it tight. It's great because that mechanism is actually adjustable, and I can use it to push the door into the seal, which gives me a really, really tight seal on it. And then it's also still accessible when you walk into the studio by simply pushing a handle that pops that thing open. And that hole is only like 3/8 of an inch, so it's a much, much smaller space for sound to get through. After I did that, I went back out into the hallway and installed some closet doors. My wife and I opted to go with louvered doors because we had our furnace inside of one of those little chambers, and so air transfer needs to happen there, and we wanted it to match. We also had an opportunity to create a closet on the other side, and so we used the same type of door there, so it was kind of, a consistent theme throughout. And so that is going to finish up part 3. I hope that you found this video helpful. And if you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider liking and subscribing, because this is the type of stuff that I love to tackle on my channel. And with that, I hope that you have a great day, and we will see you on the next video.